Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We are very excited for your engagements with Dr. Nisa Göksel's talk today, titled Narratives of Exile and Migration, Kurdish Women's Political Struggles in Europe. I'm Fulya Pınar. I'm the Alumran Family Postdoctoral Scholar at Brown University's Center for Middle East Studies. I'm really excited about Dr. Nisa Göksel's talk today. Nisa's talk will explore how the conditions of displacement and ongoing war in Turkey's Kurdistan region affect Kurdish women's struggles in Europe as migrants and political subjects. She will examine the political subjectivities and activities of Kurdish women from a transnational perspective by considering the questions of how they strive to sustain their political ties and agency despite the daily difficulties of migrant and exile life. And to introduce our speaker, Nisa Göksel is an assistant professor of sociology in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Arizona State University. She holds a PhD in sociology from Northwestern University with a graduate degree in gender and sexuality studies. And her areas of research are gender and sexuality, feminist and women's movements in the Middle East, war, violence, and peacemaking, and migration, displacement, and diaspora studies. Nisa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Julia, thank you so much for this introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me here. And I am very happy to be part of this great webinar series.
It is certainly our pleasure. So Nisa, you will have about 25-30 minutes to present, and then we will take questions from the audience. I will let you know about these questions. So now the floor is all yours. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much, Fulya. This sounds very good. So I will be sharing my slides. So hello, everyone. The title of my presentation is Narratives of Exile and Migration, Kurdish Women's Political Struggles in Europe. The conditions of war and violence, displacement and statelessness have forced the Kurdish community to maintain their political struggle beyond the states where they lived in the Middle East. Politically active Kurds from Turkey have moved to Europe for various reasons, ranging from political repression to economic deprivation. That's why living in Europe has long seemed to open up a new realm of politics for Kurds. In this context of migration, Kurdish movement has established itself beyond the borders of Turkey and Kurdistan and across Europe. Furthermore, the Kurdish movement not only generates transnational solidarity networks through its advocacy activities, but it also ideologically challenges the centrality and the hegemony of the nation-state structure itself. Like the Kurdish movement as a whole, Kurdish women faced a political struggle with a transnational character. So I examined the subject formations and political engagements that politically active Kurdish women develop in exile. And I asked the following questions. How do the conditions of displacement and the war in the Turkey's Kurdistan region affect the struggles of Kurdish women in Europe? What happens to Kurdish women's political identities when they are thus displaced? I suggest that whenever women are forced to migrate, their political attachments become displaced as well. I further argue that the political identities and acts of Kurdish women in the diaspora are shaped in a liminal space and the tenuous terrain of politics. This liminal realm of politics creates intersecting positions for Kurdish women as refugees, as migrants, and/or victims of war, while in this context, they are constantly being labeled as quote-unquote as terrorists or criminals. As a result, women's political agency is undermined, and they are socially and politically marginalized through the regimes of security and migration. For Kurdish women, life in exile becomes a liminal state of political existence. To explore this liminality, I discuss how Kurdish women's political attachments and their identities are likely to be under threat, primarily due to these issues. First of all, anti-terrorism politics in Europe and the fear of imprisonment and deportation experienced by activist Kurdish women. Second, the struggles women encounter in everyday life as migrants and refugees. And third, this is also related to the second point, the conflict between familial and political obligations, as well as women's return to the site of home and family in the face of uncertainties of migrant life. So I will now provide a very brief background on the transnationalization of the Kurdish movement. So many studies discuss the different and key aspects of the processes of Kurdish migration and the transnationalization of the Kurdish movement. In very simple terms, Kurdish migration to Europe first gained momentum in the 1960s and 70s. During this period, Kurds migrated to Europe for both economic and political reasons. Labor migration was a key factor throughout the 1960s and 70s. However, as many of my interviewees explained, even if the apparent reason for their migration was economic, most Kurds were also escaping from Turkey's assimilationist and discriminatory politics against Kurds. In the aftermath of the military intervention in 1971 and the military coup in 1980, the political pressure on Kurds intensified. And the war broke out between Turkish military forces and the Kurdish guerrilla organization PKK in 1984. And following that, Kurds began to seek asylum in European countries, which has increased the number of Kurdish immigrants there. Meanwhile, the guerrilla organization PKK began to play a crucial role in politicizing and mobilizing Kurds living in Europe. And in this context, Olivier Grosjean demonstrates that Kurds have come to be seen as the most politically active migrant group on the continent. Against this background, I will now give you some examples from my fieldwork to illustrate the experience of Kurdish activist women in diaspora. I interviewed Kurdish women activists in Germany and France, and they were refugees and immigrants, and most of them were political activists, and a few of them were former guerrillas. The women I talked to had already become politicized in the context of Turkey and Kurdistan, and so they migrated to Europe at the later stages of their lives. Activist women in Europe engage in three main activities. First of all, they put pressure on the Turkish state through the use of European political platforms. Second, they attempt to build transnational networks, and they communicate with other political groups in Europe, and they create an international public around human rights violations against Kurds. Third, they engage in community building activities, and they provide legal and psychological assistance in the case of gender-based violence, and they mediate conflicts among families, and so on. Through the first two activities, activist women appeal particularly to the European political community and transnational advocacy groups to address human rights violations against Kurds in Turkey. Through the last activity, they seek to reinforce the collectivity among Kurds and Kurdish women in the context of diaspora. And I find that there are like three main conditions that affect the women's political activities in the diaspora. First of all, the ban on the PKK and the anti-terrorism politics that's followed by the fear of imprisonment and deportation. The second point that's also raised by Bilginayata and Fiona Adamson, that Kurds are usually not being considered as part of transnational advocacy networks because they are not perceived as doing, quote unquote, doing good policy work due to their links to the PKK. And the third point is that there is this ongoing conflict between familial and political obligations, and this leads to women's return to home and family as a refuge from the difficulties of migrant life. So let me first talk about the ban on the Kurdish political activities. So it's well known that the Turkish state had already officially declared the PKK as a terrorist organization in the early 1990s. And this was followed by the condemnation of the PKK-related activities in Europe as terrorism. So despite the ban on the PKK by many European countries, they do not completely outlaw Kurdish transnational political mobilization in Europe. Hence, there appears to be a certain dilemma involved in the European states' treatment of Kurds in Europe. On the one hand, they acknowledge the human rights violations against Kurds in Turkey, but on the other hand, they still have reservations against Kurdish political activities due to the potential links to the PKK. Plus, the ban on the PKK has been used not only to criminalize pro-Kurdish political activities, but also to stigmatize Kurds and control their mobility and political activities in their everyday lives. All the European states grant refugee status to Kurds fleeing from Turkey's oppression. The PKK's quote-unquote terrorist status effectively restricts these same Kurds' political activities. A few months after 9/11, in 2002, European Union added the PKK to its list of terrorist organizations. In the words of Bilgin Ayata, the European Union's move caused Kurds living in the European countries to be seen as quote-unquote potential terrorism suspects, even if they are not affiliated with the PKK. For instance, Ayten, who has long been part of the diaspora political scene, pointed to this process in the following words. Those Kurdish people who were identified as guest workers in the past have started to be defined as terrorists since the events of 9/11. Even though both Germany and France have been prosecuting many Kurdish political activities since the early 1990s, the 9/11 has reinforced the perceptions of Kurds as a security issue there. European authorities often limit and penalize Kurdish political activities. This creates a major predicament for the activist Kurdish women. Kurdish women's political identity is an important part of who they are. So their survival in Europe is conditional on leaving their political identities behind. So this ban on the PKK affects Kurdish activist women's lives in different ways. It shifts the women's perceptions of Europe as a democratic and safe space. For instance, therein, an activist in France said, "In the past, we used to think that Europe had a democratic environment, but now we know that it doesn't provide a democratic environment for us," referring to Kurds. Many activist women expressed that their involvement in political activities might result in the loss of refugee status, rejection of their residence applications, and prosecution for their political affiliations. That's why for Kurdish women, living in Europe produces a constant state of liminality, which stems from the tension between being a migrant and exile and a political agent. The label of terrorism in particular functions as a social and political stigma for women, and this creates a precariousness involving the risk of deportation and imprisonment. In the face of these conditions, many women express that they would like to demobilize and break their ties with the Kurdish political community. And then what happens if they face with political demobilization? So in this context, many activist Kurdish women experience deep existential crisis, questioning not only the condition of their lives in Europe, but also their past commitments. Staying at home, returning to the family are among the main factors that distance women from political engagements in Europe. Hence, women in Europe feel constrained to the domestic sphere. Women's political demobilization often goes hand in hand with increasing male domination in the context of family. When activist Kurdish women come to Europe as refugees, in the absence of their political community, they might embrace familial roles by marrying and having children. However, they consider this as a step backward in their political and personal development. However, this return to familial life under the harsh conditions of exile and migration ironically creates more isolation and loneliness for women. For instance, Rojda, in an interview from France, explains the problems women experience as follows. Kurdish women in the diaspora have to look after their neighbors in France. Friends, we have to talk to women going through problems here. I think no woman here would want to remain outside the political atmosphere consciously. When they stay outside of politics, they get lonelier, they are stuck in their homes. They then become really weak and defenseless. The issue here concerns more than demobilization and the political marginalization of Kurdish women. As Rojda and many other women I interviewed noted, women who lose their political attachments may also lose their ties with the Kurdish community. Feelings of loneliness and despair become prevalent in their lives. Rojda added that women in Turkey and Kurdistan are more likely to have other support networks outside of their political networks. So they can easily establish relationships with their family members and neighbors there. However, in Europe, most of these women do not have existing familial and community networks or relations. So maintaining their connection with the Kurdish political community may be the only way to maintain their ties with Kurdistan. But many Kurdish women also express that preserving relations with the Kurdish community, as well as a revolutionary identity, is difficult to achieve in diaspora. For instance, one interviewee said that because the Kurdish women's movement is more dispersed, less visible, and less effective in the diaspora than in Turkey and Kurdistan, feudal and patriarchal inequalities predominantly shape the relations among Kurds in the diaspora. So this contributes to the major differences between men's and women's experience of migrant and refugee life. Furthermore, politically active Kurdish men in Europe are more likely to constrain the behaviors of their daughters, wives, and sisters than they were in Turkey and Kurdistan. As my interviewees explained, these men find the outside world and its unfamiliarity particularly threatening to the integrity of the family. Women, spending most of their time on domestic duties, find it difficult to disobey men's rule in the family. I also observed that most PKK meeting sites and cafes are located in the central parts of the cities, which are far from the neighborhoods where most Kurdish women live. These spaces are mostly populated by men, and they are not welcoming to women. Some women complain that even men who embrace the PKK ideology do not allow their wives to visit those spaces due to the overriding male presence there. This male dominance, as Mino Alina explains, is related to how some men and women see those party spaces, quote unquote, as public places for men. Kurdish women and men alike feel disempowered and estranged as a result of their experience of migration and asylum. They often move to European countries with their traumatic baggage of war, state violence, displacement, and imprisonment. And they develop distinct mechanisms to cope with the challenges of migrant life. However, gender dynamics complicate the experience of migration, as men and women cannot socialize and cannot create communal ties in an equal manner. The male domination in public diasporic spaces and the feeling among women of being confined to the family led many women to express that marriage and family life brought an end to their political and communal attachments. So this shows a strong association between political and diasporic ties in the context of migration. So whenever women participate in political activities, they feel more a part of a diasporic community. But my goal here is not to underplay women's roles in diaspora formation or undermine their political engagements. But my goal here is to emphasize the intricate experiences of politically active Kurdish women who strive to remain as part of a political collectivity. But at the same time, they feel isolated, excluded, and detached in their everyday lives. So overall, I have shown that politically active Kurdish women experience a few fundamental tensions within the context of migrant and refugee life. First of all, Kurdish women see living in Europe as a challenge to their politics because of the risks of assimilation into mainstream society and because of the threat of criminalization by the European states. Although many Kurdish women take refuge on the continent to escape imprisonment based on terrorism charges in Turkey, they're also vulnerable to similar charges in Europe if they act on their political engagements with the PKK. So their legality in exile is contingent on their breaking ties with the organization. Second, Kurdish women face an ongoing tension between political and familial spheres. But there has always been a tension between women's political and familial identities and obligations. And the family has been a major source of mobilization for Kurds. But the lack of communal ties in Europe leaves women more engulfed, more ingrained in the familial space, which creates further tension between their political attachments and family constraints. For women Kurdish activists, being a migrant, getting married, having children seem like steps backward in their political lives because they see the family as the locus of very patriarchal and the feudal relations that they seek to transform through their politics. Nevertheless, in the diaspora, marrying and having children become means of survival and protection from the uncertainty of exiled and migrant life. Finally, Europe seems to open up a new ground for Kurdish women to become politicized. But at the same time, it subjects them to different politics and codes of living that can fundamentally challenge their existing political subjectivities. Kurdish women's mobility is constrained by the sovereignty of the nation states, surveillance and the criminalization of Kurdish political identity, and the restrictions created by the existing familial and patriarchal norms. In turn, Kurdish women's political positionalities in Europe become displaced and become reconfigured in a way that sustaining their political affiliations becomes an existential battle. Thank you. So I will stop sharing the slides.
Thank you so much, Nisa. This was so informing and really, really interesting. So while the audience prepares their questions, please do so. I want to ask you a very, beginner level kind of a question. So how did you become interested in this topic first, and why Kurdish movement, and why Kurdish women particularly? And maybe you can provide a little bit of the historical background here on the relationship between the Turkish state and the Kurdish movement for the audience who might be rather unfamiliar with this particular context.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sure. Thank you so much, Fulya, for the questions. And, yes, I can definitely provide a more context how I become interested in this topic, and I can provide a background on the relationship between the Turkish state and the Kurdish movement. So first of all, I started this project in the context of Turkey, and especially and also in the Turkey's Kurdistan region. And especially, when I started this project, it was around 2009, 2010. And at the time, there was this rising Kurdish women's movement, and they started to become, highly visible across Turkey, across Kurdistan, even across the world, I can say. So that's why, I really become interested in their political goals, and I become interested in, their agendas and so on. So then, I decided to, explore this more as a kind of, academic project. And when I started this project in Turkey and the Turkey's Kurdistan region, I realized that this is really a transnational movement. And also, I wanted to explore the transnational side of this movement. And I find that, Europe is an important segment of the Kurdish mobilization. So as part of this research, broader research, I decided to conduct, interviews and participant observations in the context of Europe, and particularly in Paris and Berlin. So that's why I wanted to capture this transnationality and the transnational dimension of the Kurdish movement and Kurdish women's movement. So yes, in terms of, providing a background for the relationship between the Turkish state and the Kurdish movement, as I said, Turkish, the state has been, implementing racist and discriminatory politics against Kurds since, the foundation of the nation state, Turkish nation state. So that's why we can trace that historical trajectory until the, to the, establishment of the Turkish nation state. So, but especially we can say that in the 1960s and 70s, with the rise of the Kurdish and the Turkish leftist movement, we also see the rise of, the Kurdish leftist movement as well. So that's why, the PKK established itself as a guerrilla organization in this context. And following this, after, 1980 military coup, and in 1984, we see, the war started between the Kurdish guerrilla organization and the Turkish state. So that's, that's kind of, the context the Kurdish movement emerged. But after this, the rise of the armed mobilization, we see that the PKK and the Kurdish movement has expanded and has expanded into much more like formal political spheres, has expanded into activist political realms and so on after the 1990s. So that's why I mean, like within this context, with the rise of, you know, like the activist politics, we see the rise of the Kurdish women's movement too.
Thank you, Nisa.
So, yeah,
and, okay. Sorry, were you going to go?
Oh, no, that's fine. Yeah, don't worry. Yeah.
So there is a question from the audience. Julia Wortman is asking, I would be interested in knowing if any of your interlocutors also mentioned the movement's structure as a contributing factor to their isolation. For instance, does the unwritten rule not to have children interfere with their personal desires? How does the diasporic movement deal with ideological dissent? You said that people who lose ties with the movement also lose ties with the community. Is that also because the movement keeps its control over activists quite tight? And then she adds, I mean, do those who distance themselves from the movement ideologically become more isolated because of it? And then we have one more question, but first maybe you can answer this one.
Yes, sure. I mean, in Europe, I guess, so I understand, you know, like, thank you so much, first of all, for the question and for the questions. So I can say that the movement's structure and its organizational structure is similar across Europe and across Turkey and Kurdistan. But the thing is that, especially in the context of Europe, I can say that it's not as strong as in Turkey and Kurdistan, I can say. And also, you know, like, especially for the guerrilla women, you know, like they first, you know, like become guerrilla through, you know, like living, you know, like the field of family and, you know, like detaching themselves from the family relations and gender roles and so on. So, I mean, like, especially for the guerrilla women, I guess, you know, like this creates a, you know, like another layer of, you know, like predicament, you know, like having children, you know, like getting married, because they feel that they are kind of quote unquote, you know, like going against, right, their kind of, you know, like guerrilla past and, you know, like their past commitments and so on. So, but I cannot say the same thing for the, you know, like the activist women, because most of the activist women, both they can get married, they can have children. So there is no any kind of, you know, like restrictions or any kind of code around it. So they are not restricted by the movement in that sense. But I guess the problem in Europe is that they cannot juggle the two things at the same time in the context of Europe. It seems like for them like too much work, or they cannot, you know, like navigate the, you know, like the family life and the political life together. And also because of, you know, like the threat of imprisonment, threat of deportation too. So they feel that Europe is the, you know, like the last spot for them. So they feel that there is no any other space, right, to escape from, you know, like the charges of terrorism, charges of, you know, like the threat of imprisonment and so on. So they really feel that, you know, like they cannot, you know, like manage, you know, like to cope with the difficulties of both lives.
Thank you, Nisa. There is another question by Kate Ferguson, and Julia is thanking you. She's saying that was a great and informative answer. Thank you, Julia. Kate Ferguson is asking, thank you so much, Nisa. This was really interesting. I was just wondering if you encountered any tensions between political and non-political Kurdish women in the diaspora, and if so, does this perhaps contribute to the weakening of communal ties that you mentioned?
Oh, yes, I mean, this, you know, like another important and, you know, like interesting question. So the encounters between political and non-political women, I think it's very frequent, you know, like in the context of diaspora, I guess. But the thing is that, you know, like it's also important, I guess, to define what we mean by non-political. So because I mean, like most of the time I use the word the political for the women who are actively, you know, like engaging with the political activities. But there are also other group of Kurdish women, you know, like from time to time, you know, like they attend the protests, you know, like they attend the demonstrations organized in Europe, but they are not, you know, like committing, you know, like their times, committing their, you know, like energies to political activities. So that's why, you know, like when I say the political women, I'm just really referring to most of the time the women who are trying to, like devote their time to political activities full time, I guess, But the non-political women, I can say that those Kurdish women sometimes, like they engage in activities, but normally they do not involve with the Kurdish politics there. So yes, there has been, like tensions between these two groups of women. And especially, like they were, most of the time, I just came across, like they were making jokes to one another, like how, like those quote unquote non-political women become confined to the private sphere, and how they become, like disengaged with politics. They were kind of, like joking, but at the same time, like warning them and trying to make them mobilize more. And so, I mean, like these were like the kind of reminders to other women to become more politicized.
Thank you, Nisa. Yeah, we were just reading some pieces for the seminar that I'm giving on activism in the Middle East. And we were just discussing how activist people in the Middle East can be very interactive towards each other. Like the women's movement in Turkey, for example, incorporates the LGBTQ movement, Kurdish movement, Islamic movement, and all these discussions taking place. So it's not like how people in the global north usually imagine activism, where we see more like people in their own private bubbles. Whereas for communities, I guess in the diaspora too, you see more interaction among different groups, right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask a question while the audience again gathers their questions. So I feel like this mode of activism in diaspora requires a certain social political imaginary, and you're writing about this in the chapter that I have also read that you have written. So I hope for a future potentiality about Kurdistan, a better Kurdish movement, a more effective Kurdish movement, maybe. So I'm wondering if there are tensions here for Kurdish women activists between the fact that they reside in Europe, so they have residence in a territory, and there is this political and social imaginary of somewhere else, a future Kurdistan, maybe.
Yes, definitely. I mean, this is a very significant point, and this is a very important point too. Like I have been considering about this question in my larger work too. But I couldn't find a chance to talk about, this, especially about the social and the political imagination of the Kurdish movement, Kurdish women's movement in the scope of this talk. But I can say is that, I approach the social and political imagination as a transnational one. And also, especially after the 2000s, the year 2000s, I mean, this social and political imagination become much more centered in the Middle East. And which is, taking in center as the Kurdistan for sure, but the one, who would include all the Middle Eastern societies and the nations and so on. So that's why, I mean, we can take this kind of, social and political imaginary is the one originating from the Kurdistan, and also, aiming to embrace, the Middle Eastern societies and the communities, and create a much more like a peaceful and democratic space in the Middle East. But you are definitely right. I mean, this creates a huge, many, predicaments, many tensions in Europe, because in the 1990s, especially in the early 1990s, Europe has a very significant role in the mobilization of the Kurdish movement. And also they had a huge role in the transnationalization of the Kurdish movement. But after the 2000s, after the year 2000s, we see that, Europe has started to lose its central space in the transnationalization of the movement. And also that's why the Kurdish women do not feel that they belong to that transnational imagination in that sense. And that's why they feel that, quite at the margins of the Kurdish movement and the Kurdish women's movement. I think this is also, another source of tension that I couldn't mention in the talk. Yeah. Thank you for raising that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nisa. And I have so many other questions, so I will just go ahead while the audience asks more questions. So I'm also wondering, I'm asking a lot of questions on tensions, but are there tensions between gender relations imposed through these familiar relations within the diaspora versus the more idealized modes of gender relations in Europe? Like, how do these tensions also operate? And if yes, they can be maybe further alienating forces for some people. So could you tell us more about these differentiating impositions on gender and gender relations?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, thank you for for that comment and question. So yes, I mean, I guess you are referring to, right, a different kind of gender codes, like in Europe, and then also, like different kind of, like gendered ideologies and the practices in relation to the Kurdish community, right? They are still living in Europe. Yeah. So there is this, I guess, I can say, maybe there is this gap between these two levels, I guess. And also, in the article, I mentioned that the Kurdish women are highly critical of the existing gender relations and gender norms in Europe. And they always say that the European countries are kind of, saying that, like they're creating this gender equal societies, but they are saying that, okay, there's also discrimination against women in Europe too. There's this violence against women in Europe too. They constantly say these things. And then, like they say that this, like the ideal of gender equality that's created in Europe is a kind of, I can say, maybe it wouldn't be wrong to say kind of a false narrative, right? That's created by, like European countries. So that's why, I mean, like they are critical of this idea of the sexual liberation, for instance, in Europe. And most of them said to me that, like liberation, like doesn't come through, through sexual liberation, but liberation is associated with politics and life and so on. So that's why, I mean, like they kind of, like do not agree with this European understanding of sexuality, gender relations, and so on. So, I mean, like, so for sure, like there can be disagreements among women about this, but this was the, like the common pattern I noticed across the interviews. Yeah.
Thank you, Nisa. And I'll go ahead with my other question. So you have conducted ethnographic observations and rallies, protests, people's individual homes. So a lot of different places, but also on Kurdish associations, conferences, meetings, as you mentioned, in France, in Germany. There was even a Kurdish parliament that you mentioned in your chapter. So I'm curious about that too. So if we can call such spaces as modes of institutionalization of activism, how does such an institutionalization process shape activism in diaspora? When does it start? How are these more organized modes are modeled? What are they based on? How do they change over time? So if you could just, give us a sense of this different world of activism.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I can say that, like Kurdish organizations and Kurdish women's organizations really model the ones, like based in Kurdistan and Turkey. So this is probably the first thing I would need to say. But, like I was hearing from my interviewees sometimes complaints about this. So because they say that, like, because these organizations really, like model the ones in Turkey and Kurdistan, they do not really reflect their needs. They do not really, these associations do not really respond to their needs in the European political sphere. There were like complaints about this. And also I can say that most of these associations originated around, I guess, established around the early 1990s. I can say that even before that too, but I can say that, like most of them spread to many European countries in the early 1990s. With the, like increasing number of immigrants. And also these Kurdish associations, especially in the early 1990s, had an important function in mobilizing people, in bringing people together. Because as I said, people didn't have, like other places to go at the time. People didn't have any other places to communicate with other Kurds. So these, like Kurdish, political associations, I can say, created this, like diasporic collectivity. They didn't just have this political function, but they have this function of socialization and community building and so on. So that's why, I mean, like they have this double functions. But after the 2000s, like I heard many interviews said that these associations have lost their primary function because, like the social media platforms and other places kind of replaced the actual association spaces, I guess. And also, I should add that the rising anti-terrorism politics put pressure on these Kurdish association too. People become really, like hesitant in terms of visiting those spaces because they were afraid of being labeled as quote unquote terrorists or criminals, like when they enter into these spaces. So this was, like the context these spaces emerged, yeah.
Thank you, Nisa. There are two questions from the audience now. So Kate Ferguson is asking, I'd also like to ask about ties with the homeland. Did the woman you spoke to maintain strong ties with the homeland, paying regular visits to family, etc.? And did you get the sense that their political activism was ever influenced by that? In other words, by a fear of what might happen when they go to Turkey if they're too openly political?
Yes. I mean, that's another, like very significant point. Ties with homeland. I mean, this is also, like interesting because, like especially in the diaspora studies, probably you are aware the notion of homeland is also very contested. So most of the time, like I ask this question to the interviewees, like where, like where is your homeland? How, like you would imagine it. Some people, refer to their, like the larger Kurdistan as their homeland. Some of them said that they do not have a homeland because, like the region is not liberated and so on. And also some of them just refer to their, like small towns or the neighborhoods as their homeland too. In terms of their ties, I guess, like they still keep their ties through different ways. But as I said, most of these, like politically active Kurdish women already, like either they got, like imprisoned in Turkey, or they have like, like their trials still going on in Turkey. So that's why they kind of avoid, like visiting Turkey in that sense. So they cannot really keep those relationships by, like visiting the country, but at the same time, they just keep the relationships probably, like, I guess, through the social media. And they also, like organize the campaigns, organize conferences. They invite women to Europe to attend the conferences and different kind of activities. So they establish, like they continue these relationships in different ways. So I can say that the ties with homeland, like continue, but in various different ways. Yeah. And also, I guess the question was that they ever influenced, their politics is influenced by that, right? This was the rest of the question, right? So yeah, I mean, like their politics is already, like connected to Kurdistan and Turkey, right? I mean, what's really going on in Turkey kind of, like determines their political agendas and their political activities. So that's why, like they're constantly in touch and they're constantly aware of what's going on in Turkey and Kurdistan. So that's why I can say that their politics is, like influenced by, like what's happening there. Yeah.
Thank you, Nisa. Julia Wortman is asking if the critique about sexual liberation by Kurdish women in the West, so the sexual liberation in the West, the critique about this is linked again to the PKK's rules about sexuality, or in a different way. Did you feel like there was a discussion within these communities about sexuality and liberation between the women that you met? And Julia is also asking why France and Germany and not a country like Switzerland with a large Kurdish diaspora and no PKK ban?
So the last part of the question is that, like why the Germany is implementing the ban on the PKK, by what not Switzerland, right? Yeah.
I think for you to not conduct this research in Switzerland
Okay.
or places like that.
So yes, let me first start with, I guess, Julia's question and comment, right? Definitely. I mean, since the, I guess, early 1990s, there has been lots of discussions about the sexuality, the family, the gender roles, and these discussions really influenced the Kurdish women activists. And I, like I noticed that not only in Europe, but also in Turkey and Kurdistan as well. But at the same time, I can say that, I mean, these discussions are developed and kind of furthered by the activist women too. Yes, their, like ideas, their critiques about sexual liberation is tied to the PKK's critiques of the idea of sexual freedom and sexual liberation. But I also think that, like some of them really said that we cannot, like reduce, I'm quoting, we cannot reduce the idea of freedom to sexuality. Some of them really said that, but they were not really objecting the idea of the sexual liberation, but they were thinking that, like liberation must involve different components, not only sexuality. So that's why, I mean, I can say that, yes, partially it's connected to the PKK's ideas about sexuality, gender roles, and so on. But their own ideas about sexuality and gender roles too. Yeah. And also, yes, in relation to, in response to the other question, I can say that, yeah, I mean, like first, when I started this research, I think that we still do not have, like the real exact numbers of Kurdish populations across European countries. This is one of the main problems there, I guess, in terms of, population numbers of the Kurdish people. And I can say that, like when I first started that, I was reading other people's works as well. And then I was looking at, like some statistics, which are not the exact estimates, but I decided to, like to conduct the research first in Germany, because I thought that it has a long, like trajectory of Kurdish migration. So Switzerland probably took, like Kurdish migration at the later stages, but the Germany and the Turkey, like their Turkish states relationship, like goes back to the, like the 1960s and 70s, like they had this labor agreements and so on. So this kind of triggered the first Kurdish mobilization there. And so, and also, like in comparison to Germany, I needed another space. The France seems to me a good comparative case to see, like what's happening, like in another, like European country. By the way, I also conducted research in the UK too. But this is another, like this would be another, I guess, example. But I can say that Germany and France seem to me the most, having the most, like the Kurdish populations at the time, and they will have the strong relationships with the, like the Kurdish movement and so on. So that's why I choose these two contexts. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and in your chapter also you're explaining how there's this transformation from these people from labor migrants to refugees in these particular contexts. Thank you, Nisa. We have one more question from the audience. Kenda Mustafa is asking, do Kurdish women activists in Europe engage in local politics, like within Europe, for example, advocating for migrants' rights or other local issues, or is their activism more about improving the conditions back home, or both?
Yes, I mean, that's another, like the important and great point. So yes, definitely, they engage in local politics. And I met many activist women. They were engaging with the municipal politics in their own neighborhoods in Germany and France. And there was one thing I observed. And they were also, like engaging in activities to promote migrant rights too, because they were, like establishing solidarities with the other groups as well. Like, for instance, like they engage with, especially in the UK, I noticed this, they engage with the Tamils and the Palestinians, and they, like organized, like events together and conferences together in order to, like raise this issue of statelessness and to raise their concerns about this, like the ban on the PKK and so on. So that's why, like they seek to create this local networks, I can say, across different European countries with these different groups too. But they also engage in, like the European Parliament. There are like representatives in the European Parliament as well. And yeah, local politics is an important part of their politics, but I guess, like they still do these activities to promote the Kurdish political cause as well. So they're like kind of, like two agendas are together. Yeah.
Thank you, Nisa. And I have one question. So in your chapter, you're using a term called political entrepreneurship. So you're saying that some of the people in diaspora serve as political entrepreneurs. Can you explain what you mean with this to us? And is this position an extension of this liminal space that these people are occupying, because the political, the collective seems kind of in tension with entrepreneurship, which usually is a more liberal, individualistic endeavor?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think I used that term in relation to Bilginayata's research on, displaced, right, immigrants in Europe. Yes, definitely. I mean, like she's using that term in order to emphasize that, like we cannot take these immigrants and, like refugees as, like passive personas or passive individuals. She's using this, like as a kind of, like as a way to emphasize how these, like groups of people, even though, like they're victims of war, they're victims of violence and etc., they can still, like forge political mobilization, they can still establish political relations and so on. So, but you are definitely right. The notion of political entrepreneurship is loaded in that way, in a political sense. And it's also kind of, I guess, used mainly to refer to mainstream conventional political sides. But I guess, like my goal to use that phrase just to emphasize that, okay, these people cannot be seen as, like passive individuals, but they're political entrepreneurs. They're just promoting their political agendas and so on. But at the same time, like I also say that, okay, this is both, like empowering and disempowering too. That's why, like I kind of open up this discussion of the tensions experienced by the Kurdish women, because we cannot just see the political entrepreneurship as a kind of, like homogeneous field, but it's also, like very loaded with tensions, ambiguities, and which I call them as, like liminalities. And so that's why I mean, like, you are definitely right. So we cannot take this notion as it is, but we need to consider its own predicaments, difficulties, and so on. Yeah.
Thank you, Nisa. And this will be my final question if there are no other questions from the audience. So you already mentioned a little bit about these intersectional aspect of struggles among different diasporas. So do you see parallels between the Kurdish movement, the Palestinian liberation movement, and other Arab diaspora movements in Europe, in global North? Just your comments on this, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, like for this question. Yes, I mean, as I mentioned, like they establish solidarities with different, like diaspora communities in Europe. But interestingly, when I was in Germany and France, I didn't notice much of these, like kind of, like solidarity attempts. But the most solidarity attempts, like I observed was in UK. So, and in the UK also, like there is this, like different kind of associations, like diaspora associations. They try to bring together, like the political concerns of, like, as I said, Kurds, Tamils, the Palestinians, and the others. So, but probably I do not have one specific response to why this is the case. But what I can say is that, like most of the time, they want to establish solidarities with the groups who are in a similar position with them. So for instance, I didn't see, like any event they organize with the, like Arab diaspora, for instance. I didn't see any event like that, but I saw like events, like organized with the Palestinian groups and with the Tamils. And also, like they were just referring to this, like the experience of statelessness too as a common experience to mobilize solidarities with these communities. So that's why, I can say that they establish solidarities most with those, like communities with the most common experiences, I can say.
Thank you, Nisa. And my final question. So what are you working on now, or what is your next project now?
So yes, thank you. Yes, yeah. So I'm currently working on my book project. So I'm in the initial stage of this research I conducted at the time of my dissertation research. So currently I'm just working on turning my dissertation into a book. So like my broader project, as I said, like include the Kurdish women's mobilization in Turkey, Turkish Kurdistan region, and Europe as well. So in this broader project, I just trace the whole mobilization in this whole geography. And I am trying to understand, like their mobilizations in different kind of spaces and what kind of different political activisms they developed, what kind of tensions, like they experience, what kind of dilemmas they encounter. And also, like I am also trying to understand, like especially in the context of transnationalism, what kind of solidarities they try to establish, and to what extent or how these solidarities sometimes fail and sometimes become effective. So this is like the broader, I guess, like the broader aspect of my research. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nisa. This was so informative and so interesting. I'm sure there will be a lot of students also watching this. Am I seeing another question? Oh, okay. Kate Ferguson, and we have a couple of more minutes, so let's answer that too, if that's possible. So Kate Ferguson is asking, I'd love to hear more about your research in the UK. Can we request another talk soon? They're asking.
Thank you for this, comment. Yeah, I would love to give another talk about my research in the UK, and I'm actually writing a book chapter about that. Yeah, I would love to share it. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, for this comment.
Would you like to talk a little bit more about the research in UK?
Yeah, definitely.
Just a couple of minutes.
Yeah. As I said, like the interesting thing about the UK is that there were like lots of solidarity groups, I can say, and these solidarity groups work kind of, like in order to lift the ban on the PKK. So that's why, like there is this, and also, like there were people like German lawyers involved in the solidarity groups, UK lawyers involved, the UK activists involved into these groups. And these groups come together primarily to address this issue of this anti-terrorism politics and how it is implemented against Kurds and the other groups. So that's why, like their specific work is about this, I can say, anti-terrorism politics and rising politics after 9/11. So that's why, like I find this, like activism in the UK important, and I see there much more like collaborations across various solidarity groups there. Yeah.
Okay, Nisa, thank you so much. We already taken a lot of your time. This was great. Thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone for joining us. It was very nice to see all of you. And yeah, hope to see you next time when we invite Nisa, their request for it. So
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Fulya, and for everyone for joining and for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisa.